After many narrow escapes, we arrived at Spitzbergen on the 23rd of June and anchored at Wyjade Bay for a short time, where we were quite successful in our catches. We then lifted anchor and sailed through the Hinlopen Strait and coasted along the northeast land, inset 2. It will be remembered that Andre started on his fatal balloon voyage from the northwest coast of Spitzbergen. So several times during this, we'll interject with notes, side notes. They started along the Hinlopen Strait and coasted along the northeast land. A strong wind came up from the southwest, and my father said that we had better take advantage of it and try to reach Franz Josef Land, where the year before he had by accident found the ivory tusks that had brought him such a good price at Stockholm. Never before or since have I seen so many seafowl. They were so numerous that they hid the rocks on the coastline and darkened the sky. For several days we sailed along the rocky coast of Franz Josef Land. Finally, a favoring wind came up that enabled us to make the west coast, and, after sailing 24 hours, we came to a beautiful inlet. One could hardly believe it was the north end. The place was green with growing vegetation, for while the area did not comprise more than 1 or 2 acres, yet the air was warm and tranquil. It seemed to be at that point where the Gulf Stream's influence is most keenly felt. And inset, Sir John Barrow Bart, in his work entitled Voyages of Discovery and Research within the Arctic Regions, says on page 57, Mr. Beechey refers to what has frequently been found and noticed, the mildness of the temperature on the western coast of Spitzbergen, there being little or no sensation of cold, though the thermometer might be only a few degrees above the freezing point. The brilliant and lively effect of a clear day, when the sun shines forth with a pure sky, whose azure hue is so intense as to find no parallel even in the boasted Italian sky. And we'll note in the other documents that we'll get to that they talk about the same thing, that once they reach a certain distance north, that it ceases to become so cold. On the east coast there were numerous icebergs, yet here we were in open water. Far to the west of us, however, were ice packs, and still farther to the westward the ice appeared like ranges of low hills. In front of us and directly to the north lay an open sea. Captain Kane on page 299, quoting from Morton's journal, 26 December, says, "As far as I could see, the open passages were 15 miles or more wide, with sometimes mashed ice separating them. But it is all small ice, and I think it either drives out to the open space to the north or rots and sinks, as I could see none ahead to the north." And we'll notice that in the other portions where this is the main hindrance to travelers trying to get there, that it's the ice pack. Its early onset in winter and its late leaving in the summer makes it that there's very little time where you can safely get through the ice pack and get to the actual area of the pole. So it would be known, that's why it's known as the land beyond the north. And we'll get into later the actual, and you'll see it here as we go through in the photos, you'll see the actual route that these people took to get there, through the northern parts of Canada or Scandinavia or Russia. My father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor, and had frequently told me they were gods who came from far beyond the north wind. There was a tradition, my father explained, that still farther northward was a land more beautiful than that any mortal had ever known, and that it was inhabited by the chosen. We find the following in Dutch mythology, page 778, from the pen of Jacob Grimm. "Then the sons of Bor," as in Borea, or Hyperborea, "built in the middle of the universe the city called Asgard, where dwell the gods and their kindred, and from that abode work out so many wondrous things, both on the earth and in the heavens above it. There is in that city a place called Hidskalf, and when Odin is seated there, upon his lofty throne, he sees over the whole world, and discerns all the actions of men." My youthful imagination was fired by the ardor, zeal, and religious fervor of my good father, and I exclaimed, "Why not sail to this goodly land? The sky is fair, the wind favorable, and the sea open." From Plato. "He is the god who sits in the center, on the navel of the earth, and he is the interpreter of religion to all mankind." Plato. And we'll be reading from Plato later as well. Even now I can see the expression of pleasurable surprise on his countenance, as he turned toward me and asked, "My son, are you willing to go with me and explore? To go far beyond, where man has ever ventured?" I answered affirmatively. "Very well," he replied. "May the god Odin protect us." And, quickly adjusting the sails, he glanced at our compass, turned the prow in due northerly direction through an open channel, and our voyage had begun. Hall writes on page 288, on 23rd January, the two Eskimo, accompanied by two of the seamen, went to Cape Lupton. They reported a sea of open water extending as far as the eye could reach. The sun was low in the horizon, as it was still the early summer. Indeed, we had almost 4 months of day ahead of us before the frozen night could come on again. Our little fishing sloop sprang forward, as if eager as ourselves for adventure. Within 36 hours we were out of sight of the highest point on the coastline of Franz Josef Land. We seemed to be in a strong current running north by northeast. Far to the right and to the left of us were icebergs, but our little sloop bore down in the narrows and passed through channels and out into open seas, channels so narrow in places that, had our craft been other than small, we could never have gotten through. On the third day we came to an island. Its shores were washed by an open sea. My father determined to land and explore for a day. This new land was destitute of timber, but we found a large accumulation of driftwood on the northern shore. Some of the trunks of the trees were 40 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. Greeley tells us in Volume 1, page 1, that Privates Connell and Frederick found a large coniferous tree on the beach just above the extreme high water mark. It was nearly 30 inches in circumference, some 30 feet long, and had apparently been carried to that point by a current within a couple of years. A portion of it was cut up for firewood, and for the first time in that valley, a bright, cheery campfire gave comfort to man. After one day's exploration of the coast of this land, we lifted anchor and turned our prow to the north in an open sea. Dr. Kane says on page 379, "I cannot imagine what becomes of the ice. A strong current sets in constantly to the north, but from altitudes of more than 500 feet, I saw only narrow strips of ice, with great spaces of open water, from 10 to 15 miles in breadth, between them. It must, therefore, either go to an open space in the north, or dissolve." I remember that neither my father nor myself had tasted food for almost 30 hours. Perhaps this was because of the tension of excitement about our strange voyage in waters farther north. My father said, than anyone had ever been before. Active mentality had dulled the demands of the physical needs. Instead of the cold being intense as we had anticipated, it was really warmer and more pleasant than it had been while in Hammerfest on the north coast of Norway some 6 weeks before. Captain Peary's second voyage relates another circumstance which may serve to confirm a conjecture which has long been maintained by some, that an open sea free of ice exists at our near pole. On the 2nd of November, says Peary, the wind freshened up to a gale from north by west, lowered the thermometer before midnight to 5 degrees, whereas a rise of wind at Melville Island was generally accompanied by a simultaneous rise in the thermometer at low temperatures. May not this, he asks, be occasioned by the wind blowing over an open sea in the quarter from which the wind blows, and tend to confirm the opinion that at or near the pole an open sea exists? And this is what ties in with the other reading that I've done, but I've been having problems with my software, so the other reading is not ready yet. But this is letters from a sailor who attended a royal expedition to the North Pole in the early 1800s, the 1820s, and he writes letters continually to his brother while he is away. And during those writings, he continually, in every letter, he gives constant bearings. He gives his constant latitude and longitude. And as they move up from the 60th, 65th, 70th, 75th parallel, and they get up into the 80th and get right up there to the North Pole, and as they're moving westward, they move across the 90th, 95th, 100th, 103rd degree of longitude, and he keeps talking about where he is. And Melville Island is a place in Canada, and there's pictures of it here in this document, or in this show that you'll see, where it's the channels with the boats in the north, and that's Melville Island. It looks like a giant rock a barren rock. And so you see that there's places there where it's incredibly barren and ice-filled up in the islands, and then there's other places where there are trees. It's supposed to be past the Krummholz zone, where trees don't grow anymore. And we'll get into some other interesting things that happen at those latitudes, such as the magnetic dip of the needle. So back to the Hollow Earth story by Jansen. So we were on about Captain Peary, and there's an open sea near the North Pole. We both frankly admitted that we were very hungry, and forthwith I prepared a substantial meal from our well-stored larder. When we had partaken heartily of the repast, I told my father I believed I would sleep, as I was beginning to feel quite drowsy. "Very well," he replied, "I will keep the watch." I have no way to determine how long I slept. I only know that I was rudely awakened by a terrible commotion of the sloop. To my surprise, I found my father sleeping soundly. I cried out lustily to him, and starting up, he sprang quickly to his feet. Indeed, had he not instantly clutched the rail, he would certainly have been thrown into the seething waves. A fierce snowstorm was raging. The wind was directly astern, driving our sloop at a terrific speed, and was threatening every moment to capsize us. There was no time to lose. The sails had to be lowered immediately. Our boat was writhing in convulsions. A few icebergs we knew were on either side of us, but fortunately the channel was open directly to the north. But would it remain so? In front of us, girding the horizon from left to right, was a vaporish fog or mist, black as Egyptian night at the water's edge, and white like a steam cloud toward the top, which was finally lost to view as it blended with the great white flakes of falling snow. Whether it covered a treacherous iceberg, or some other hidden obstacle against which our little sloop would dash and send us to a watery grave, or it was merely the phenomenon of an Arctic fog, there was no way to determine. On the page 284 of his works, Hall writes, "From the top of Providence Berg, a dark fog was seen to the north, indicating water. At 10 a.m., 3 of the men, Kruger, Nindemann, and Hobby, went to Cape Lupton to ascertain, if possible, the extent of the open water. On their return they reported several open spaces and much young ice, not more than a day old, so thin that it was easily broken by throwing pieces of ice upon it. By what miracles we escaped being dashed to utter destruction I do not know. I remember our little craft creaked and groaned as if joints were breaking. It rocked and staggered to and fro as if clutched by some fierce undertow of whirlpool or maelstrom. Fortunately our compass had been fastened with long screws to a crossbeam. Most of our provisions, however, were tumbled out and swept away from the deck of the cuddy, and had we not taken the precaution at the very beginning to tie ourselves firmly to the masts of the sloop, we should have been swept into the lashing sea. Above the deafening tumult of the raging waves I heard my father's voice. 'Be courageous, my son,' he shouted. 'Odin is the god of the waters, the companion of the brave, and he is with us. Fear not.' To me it seemed there was no possibility of our escaping a horrible death. The little sloop was shipping water. The snow was falling so fast as to be blinding, and the waves were tumbling over our counters in reckless white-sprayed fury. There was no telling what instant we should be dashed against some drifting ice pack. The tremendous swells would heave us up to the very peaks of mountainous waves, and then plunge us down again into the depths of the sea's trough, as if our fishing sloop were a fragile shell. Gigantic white-capped waves like veritable walls fenced us in, fore and aft. This terrible, nerve-wracking ordeal, with its nameless horrors of suspense and agony of fear, indescribable, continued for more than 3 hours, and all the time we were being driven forward at fierce speed. Then suddenly, as if growing weary